Hello and welcome to this AgFunderNews roundtable, all about the new US Dietary Guidelines, which is fair to say have generated quite a lot of debate over the past couple of weeks. So to unpack what's going on, I'm joined by a panel of experts. And so I would like to introduce my panel. On the top right, we have Dr. Rachel Cheetham, who is founder at consultancy Foodscape and also an adjunct assistant professor at Tufts University. On the bottom right, we have Dr. Kevin Klatt, who is assistant professor at the University of Toronto. And on the bottom left, we have Dr. Ty Beale, who is head of food systems data and analytics at the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition and host of the Ty Beale Show. And I'm Elaine Watson at AgFunderNews. So let's begin with the basics. What are the guidelines for and why do they even matter? Maybe, Rachel, you could kick off.
Well, the dietary guidelines for Americans have been around for decades. They're updated every 5 years. And even though it's probably safe to say your average American consumer may not necessarily know about them, sure, they really are the underpinning for federal nutrition policy. So they would influence things like school foods, women, infant, and children, SNAP, other benefit programs. So they really are the backbone of federal nutrition policy.
Is the latest document is, I think the previous document, you probably know the exact page number, but it was 160 something pages, I believe. The latest document is 10 pages. Ty, I know you were involved in putting together the guidelines. Why have such a short document this time? And is that a good thing, or does this mean a lack in detail for people that are trying to implement this in for federal nutrition programs?
Yeah, I think the administration clearly communicated they wanted a short document many months ago. And so that was sort of the intent. I was involved in the scientific review group that wrote the background reviews, and you can see those on the website realfood.gov as well.
Yes. And
then sort of similar to earlier previous processes, sort of we were in charge with generating all of this evidence, and then the administration this year, the HHS put together the guidelines, right? I think that it's very clear from the website and the imagery that this is for consumers as well, for the general public. I think that's a deviation from past years where it was really focused on the practitioners and policymakers. So I think we have a bit of both here. It's certainly more like sort of concise, simpler, but it doesn't get into the nitty-gritty and the details as much, right? In terms of what does that actually mean when you translate that into school meals, for example.
So, but isn't there, haven't in previous years, we've had the longer document, which is for, as you say, the practitioners and also consumers if they want to look at it, but then separate materials and graphics for consumers. Why not do that this time rather than just having the actual document itself being so short?
I think, I can't speak for the administration, but I think the intent was probably to have the actual average American read this document, right, to be able to actually look through and see some of the bullets and the high-level top-line findings that are really suggesting this whole foods, minimally processed foods, and to restrict the highly processed foods, the refined grains, and the added sugars. So I think you see that in the imagery as well in this upside down inverted pyramid where you're seeing pictures of actual foods. Now, I think there's a lot of critiques around should that be a plate with actual,
so there it is, yeah.
sections, exactly. You can see that there. And I think there's a lot of different comments on the actual image. Like I've heard the steak is really big, right? I've heard the broccoli is really big. Where's the broccoli lobby going here? I think that this is not, it's not easy to just look at this picture and know what serving sizes should we be consuming. That's actually in the documentation that you would have to read, right? And I think one of the things that's fascinating is that I think for the first time, at least in my lifetime that I can remember, just about everyone I've spoken to, for strangers or acquaintances or friends who typically wouldn't even know about the guidelines are talking, they've heard about the pyramid, right? So I think that that's something that's sort of different, is like there is this big splash that was made, right?
Kevin, can I just bring you in? I mean, do you see a kind of disconnect between what's actually in the guidelines, in the text of the guidelines, and what we're actually seeing in this visual here? For example, the text, we just got it in front of me, says 2 to 4 servings of whole grains, whereas they're kind of right at the very bottom of the pyramid. And the text also says eat a variety of protein foods from animal sources, eggs, poultry, seafood, and so on, as well as a variety of plant-based protein sources, whereas the actual graphic maybe doesn't reflect that. Is there a disconnect there, Kevin? I think you're on mute.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's going to look at this and see what they kind of want to see from it potentially. I don't think there's a one-to-one necessarily, but the words that are written in the actual document, like the Dietary Guidelines document, that's 10 pages, I don't think translates exactly to this sort of picture here that you're seeing where, I mean, as Ty said, the portion sizes, the relative amounts, it doesn't seem to really, like, the point of a pyramid is to have what's to be minimal at the sort of cone at the top. They sort of went for the flipping upside down for the kind of South Park reference, it seems. And you would, looking at this, I would say that this is kind of what like maybe a reduced carbohydrate dietary pattern that's heavy on animal foods would be focused on. So you see at the base, like non-starchy vegetables, and then fats and oils and protein sources, and then you kind of get quite minimal. It also looks like in the online world, there's a big low carb, low omega-6 fatty acid kind of diet community that's quite loud. And this looks exactly kind of what they're arguing for. It doesn't really reflect the 3 to 4 servings of whole grains per day that were recommended. It doesn't really show very many plant-based protein sources. You see a few beans sprinkled there on some rice, 1 or 2 of each type of nut, and then you have entire turkeys, entire salmons. So I think the proportions here, the distribution of like what a meal should look like, I think their whole goal here was, I think, to have something, you know, that's catchy. So the inverted pyramid. This administration has been talking for months about the pyramid as though we didn't stop using that in, 2011 was when my plate came, but the updated pyramid, that was an update of the 1992 one that got critiqued quite a bit for having grains at the base, was in 2005. So we have not used like that old pyramid that they've been blasting in pictures everywhere for 20 plus years. So I think they went for the vibe, like the influencer vibes, a whole bunch more with this edition of messaging, more than they necessarily like tried to have this be a perfect representation of what's in the guidelines. But
Can we talk a bit about the process? Maybe you can bring me back in on this, Ty. So historically, I understand it that the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee that's appointed by us, the HHS, spends 24 months going through the literature and then provides a scientific report that hands back over to those government agencies that then put together the guidelines. So we do have that report, which is hundreds of pages long. But this year we've had this 90-page document called the Scientific Foundation for the Dietary Guidelines, and then we've got some fairly extensive appendices. And if you look at the rationale for that, it talks about addressing and correcting deficiencies in the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report. So as I understand it, Ty, you were one of the scientific sort of reviewers. Can you explain why the process differed this year?
Yeah, so I think if you understand the process of the committee, it's a long process, and they go through, like you said, up to 2 yeas of working on this. And there was a desire, I think, from the administration to do something much quicker. They wanted to act, and so from as soon as the administration took charge, I think they started working on building this team. And so one distinction is that we were not a committee in the precise term. We were scientific authors of this background review. And so we were, we had less time than the previous committee, but we were also working probably much more like full time on this than previous committees, right? Because I think before they're sort of spaced out quite a bit when people meet together. And so I know I was working pretty intensively at times. So I think there was a difference there. I can't really speak to the process of how this was translated. I can just say that if you read the scientific background documentation, at first it lays out sort of what is similar and what's taken from the committee's report, the previous committee's report, which there are a number of things that are either taken in full or partially taken, and there's a number of things that weren't taken necessarily. And part of that was due to the intention of having this be a bit more streamlined and not be so lengthy. And so it wasn't necessarily from disagreeing with certain things, but it was with making it concise. And then part of it was specific disagreements, which you can see in that report. But then again, it's sort of like we do the work in the background report, and then the administration goes through and writes out the document with their own scientists. I think that there's pretty clear alignment when you look at the evidence reviews and the background synthesis report, which you said is about 90 pages, from what's actually recommended. There's a few discrepancies, but it's generally pretty aligned.
So, Kevin, I want to bring you in here. So the Scientific Foundation report, it says the original Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee consistently advocated plant-based dietary patterns and deprioritized animal-sourced proteins, and recommended that fat replacements focus on plant-based sources. But isn't this what the science actually supports?
I think it depends which science you look at and how you synthesize it. Obviously, the 90-page report has deviated quite substantially from that.
Yeah.
We could get into why that is, but there are different values and judgment calls and looks at the evidence. I think when you bring on a team of like 6 or so different scientific reviewers with a set out goal of find me the science to support this sort of perspective, then you kind of can mush that all together and kind of come to whatever conclusions you want. I think this is the problem with nutrition science, particularly when you're looking at chronic diseases, that you can always find a piece of evidence or some evidence. You can focus on prospective cohorts with disease endpoints. You can focus on short-term trials with any number of outcomes, and you can find sources of evidence to support a recommendation, but it's not necessarily always the totality of that evidence. So this is we don't lock people up for years and completely control their diets until they have a heart attack or whatever. So there's often a triangulation across a lot of evidence, ensuring nutritional adequacy, reducing chronic disease risk. I think there's a clear deviation from the DJAC process this time around. And there's been lots of robust discussion about that. I don't know how into the weeds we want to get.
I mean, for example, do you want to come in there, Todd?
Yeah. Could I just add? Yeah, I think that one discrepancy from the pyramid versus the guidelines is that the pyramid makes it look like the prioritization should be on animal source proteins. You can see some nuts and seeds and beans, but they're in smaller sizes, right? They're not they don't take up as much space. If you look at the guidelines on protein, it says consume a variety of protein foods, right? From animal and plant sources. And if you look at the serving sizes, it's right there. It has a variety, right? It lists out the different sources from plants and animals, including soy. And then in the servings guide, it kind of tells you the equivalent servings, right? To get a similar kind of proportion of protein. Of course, they're not nutritionally equivalent, but it gives you an example. And then there's also recommendations for vegan and vegetarian diets, where it's how do you make these diets and construct them in a way that's healthy. Of course, not at a very granular level, but at a high level. So I think that in general intent of the guidelines, as I read them, is that we're not prioritizing plant-based or animal-based. It's sort of, we're saying a diverse of both. But the messaging, I've seen a lot of messaging that has sort of made the emphasis. You've seen the steak, or there's been an emphasis on that. So I think there's a bit of like messaging discrepancy from what's written in the guidelines themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why graphics really matter, though, isn't it? Because that is, as you say, most consumers aren't going to read.
Just going to look at the pyramid.
They're just going to. This is what that's being shared on social media. This is what people are taking away, if people are paying attention at all. And the top line sort of messaging, if you look at this image, does seem to prioritize sort of animal proteins and fats.
I would just add to that. I don't know the written word is super internally consistent either, because you have a 1.2 to 1.6 gram per kilo increase of the protein, which they kind of in the review report give sort of 100 gram absolute target for that. And if you do 3 cups of whole milk, you'll get your 24 grams of protein from that. And then they give you 3 to 4 servings on a 2,000 calorie diet of protein foods to make up that other 75 grams or so, which do it. And then the serving sizes that they list for nuts is like 6 grams per serving. So if you did all 4 of your servings from the, from a plant-based nut, you'd only get 24 grams. If you did it from the half cup of legumes that they recommend, it's probably about 12 grams, so you'd get 48. So you have to have a pretty animal food heavy diet to hit their protein recommendations, unless you're eating like tons of Greek yogurt from the dairy sources. So I think the messaging that they're doing on social media, the depictions in the graph, the upping of the protein recommendation, and then how they define protein serving sizes pretty clearly indicates that like most of the protein you'll be getting in the diet would be animal protein over plant protein, which is a pretty big inverse of not only the DJAC report, but pretty international dietary guidelines. So go for it.
One other thing that actually appears different too is the whole grains, where if you see the serving sizes, there's sort of a recommendation for 2 to 4 servings, which does not, it's not, you wouldn't see sort of the top of a pyramid showing that many servings, right? So I think there's a little bit of a conflicting messaging there in terms of the quantity. And if you look at the actual serving sizes, 2 to 4 servings of whole grains is actually a fair amount, considering even the protein food group is 3 to 4 servings. This is assuming a 2,000 calorie diet.
So just Rachel, I want to bring you in here on protein, because, if you look at the packaged food industry, which I've been writing about for years, protein is everywhere now. I mean, it goes in ebbs and flows, but certainly at the moment you've got Beyond Meat just launching a protein beverage with 30 grams, I think, of protein in, or was it 20 grams? Either way, it's a lot of protein. I'm getting stuff in my inbox with, sparkling beverages with 30 grams of protein and so on. So these new protein recommendations recommend a near doubling of the current RDA. So the current RDA is 0.8 grams of protein per kilo of body weight. These new recommendations say 1.2 to 1.6 grams. Is this based on new science, or is this based on some kind of changing consensus about moving towards some kind of optimum protein level versus just, avoiding deficiency? I mean, what are these new recommendations based on, and do we need more protein?
Right. So I think that one key piece that stood out to me when I really looked at the full report, not just the 10-page version, is there was a good bit of discussion on the AMDRs, the acceptable macronutrient distribution range, which says we could have 10 to 35% of our calories from protein. That's a big range, 10 to 35%. If you were to translate that roughly into the how many grams per kilogram, you would be upwards of up to even 2.5 grams per kilogram if it was about 35% of your calories. So in some respects, this new call out to 1.2 to 1.6 is high. It could be seen as a doubling because it's no longer listing the 0.8 RDA. On the other hand, if I go into my AMDR land, this is still in that range. So I found it interesting what they decided to call out in the, the text 10-page version versus what is delineated in the full, scientific foundation document. I think the other piece that we've hit at some length here, but it's worth repeating, is this balance between plant and animal. And I found that the visual does make it look like a whole steak, a whole chicken, or, one peanut or one walnut. So despite what the language is saying, the visual and the discussion I'm hearing among, the kind of the influencer community and other places, it really feels like the advice is eat more animal protein. And I don't think that is what we need to do for better health. I wish that there could be a little more nuance here and the recognition that there's a continuum of animal and plant proteins, and we have our complete proteins and our incomplete, and how would you pair them? I simply wish that there was more nuance and discussion of the quality of the protein, not just sort of this sort of high-low debate. But I do think we're going to see quite a few products coming in the packaged food and beverage space. Like you were already mentioning, some of the functional beverages adding in protein. That trend has already been there, and it is going to continue, and it's going to be a race to get more and more grams of protein. And the reality is excess protein what's excess for one person can vary to the next, but excess protein can turn to fat. Excess protein will still raise insulin. Protein feels like it's given a free pass here to just eat more and more and more protein. And I think that doesn't align with a preponderance of the nutrition science behind this.
I mean, yeah, I mean, if you're leading a fairly, very physically active lifestyle, I guess your requirements might be a little different.
Your needs will be higher, and it is in that full report, again, about the AMDR. And if you're eating more protein, be sure to pair that with strength training. Like there for sure are individuals that can benefit from higher protein, certainly higher than the 0.8 grams that the low end of the RDA would have us at. I just wish that both the triangle visual, the pyramid visual, and this screen we're looking at now about the written version for the consumer, I wish it had more of that sense of the range and how you would calibrate that range for individuals. And it just feels like there's a little bit more of a translation step that's going to be needed for people.
Kevin, any thoughts on that? Would a more nuanced sort of recommendations about protein be valuable, or what about this blanket recommendation that we just need to eat more?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, you got to what the evidence was, and they do a rapid systematic review. I mean, this range is not really that surprising of a number if you're familiar with some of the weight loss and sports science literature. Like these are, as a clinical dietitian, I've recommended very high protein diets like this in the past. And they basically do this systematic review that's very quick and dirty. And it's they pull in this extremely heterogeneous literature base that's a lot of active weight loss studies or studies that are doing resistance exercise training. And they sort of hand wave about like, oh, there's generally better body composition or body outcomes. And this is not hidden. This is in most obesity medicine guidelines. This is in sports medicine guidelines as well. Just for the general population that isn't typically in an active weight loss program. These trials that they're relying on are pretty short term, very heterogeneous in their design and outcomes. And so it's not typically an evidence base that would inform sort of an update of the RDA for a more general healthy population. If everybody in America started actively losing weight and started doing a ton of resistance exercise training, I'd say there's like a real conversation to be had about maybe bumping up the RDA number a little bit. But I think it's a place again where, as I said, you can always look at the entire body of literature and cut out a section of it to come to a conclusion you want. And if you wanted to say, okay, we're going to dramatically increase protein recommendations, I would have told you a priori before ever looking at this, just go systematically review the weight loss and exercise science data if you want to come up with a number that's twice as high. But if you look at the broad majority of the data that's out there, the DRIs for macronutrients are being updated right now, and the AHRQ that does the systematic reviews has released the protein systematic review updates, and they basically say since 2000, when the last DRIs were updated essentially in 2005, the evidence really doesn't support that higher protein intakes is protective against chronic diseases, even things like sarcopenia, which is the age-related muscle loss. And there's really not much evidence to support updates of individual amino acid requirements. So it's not too surprising that the evidence is kind of flat, because the government kind of stopped funding that sort of work 25 years ago, and the epidemiology is all over the place, but largely supports, again, that it's things in plant foods, probably the added fiber, phytonutrients, whatever you want to call it, that are more protective. And so as we focus more on high quality plant-based sources of protein, it's about achieving adequacy while getting all the other good stuff that comes in with plants that might be protective against chronic disease, more so than it is just about chasing a number and any source of that protein, which, getting back to your packaged food kind of situation, it's like, adding protein to Pop-Tarts and Cheerios and to a sweetened beverage or super high protein yogurt isn't necessarily, like, in and of itself going to be protective against chronic disease or lead to dramatic weight loss or address obesity. So this is an area where I think we start to get pretty out of step with global guidelines across all the countries that the administration typically loves to cite, of Europe is healthier, Japan is leaner and all. None of them are recommending protein levels this high, and the current American intakes are already around 1 to 1.2 grams per kilo. So it's not like this is, I don't think this is gonna have a revolutionary effect on our waistlines, our body composition, or our chronic disease risk.
What about fats? I mean, that's another area.
Could I just,
Elaine, sure, go for it.
Chime in here. I think it's very clear from the guidelines that it's talking about whole food sources of protein. It doesn't say anywhere to add protein to Pop-Tarts. I mean, if anything, this is much stronger language against the highly processed foods that industry would do that to. So I think if it's going to be taken out of context, it's from industry intentionally trying to tap into that protein thing. That's not what the guidelines are saying, right? I also think it's very supported that optimal intakes of protein is above the 0.8 RDA. I don't think that should be very debatable, especially when you consider most people from health recommendations should be doing some exercise and resistance training. And so I think the goal is, obviously, we want people to be doing more exercise and resistance training. And so the other point is that the evidence, if you look at those reviews, they do look at a lot of the weight loss literature, right, and the body composition. But 3/4 of adults are overweight or obese in the U.S. So I do think there's an appropriate focus here. I don't think it necessarily. I mean, 1.2, like Kevin said, you can get that. Most people are already getting that or close to that, right? And so I think that there's plenty of ways to get that much protein from whole food sources. I would just emphasize there's nothing in the guidelines that suggests that we should be just having highly processed foods with added protein. I don't think that I agree with everyone here that is not going to be healthful and is not a good approach to the protein issue.
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's again, as always with guidelines, there's what people take away from it, and there's what's actually in the text. And my sense is that what consumers are taking away from this, and the packaged food industry at least, we're going to see more protein fortification, and we're going to see more no seed oil call outs, even though, again, we'll talk about fats in a moment. That's not specifically discussed in the guidelines. But let me just move on to fats. I just pulled up this, add that on stage. So this has generated a lot of discussion. It talks about healthy fats in whole foods. It also talks about nuts, seeds, olives, avocados, and so on. It's talking about cooking. When cooking with or adding fats to meals, prioritize oils with essential fatty acids. I mean, that's generated some discussion, but it talks about olive oil. Other options include butter or beef tallow. So again, the food industry, for example, in many packaged food products, I saw a press release only the other day from a company with protein bars, now with beef tallow. And there's lots of kind of snack products that are saying no seed oils as a call out. Rachel, can you maybe just talk a little bit about some of the confusion over fats in this guidance, particularly mixed messaging around saturated fat?
Right. I think that, to back up a little bit, the topic of dietary fats is a confusing one, both when you dig into the literature and often for consumers. I think at a very high level, when I read this around incorporating healthy fats, I thought that's excellent. Yes to the omega-3s, yes to the nuts and the seafood. We can get that from meat, poultry, eggs, like that opening salvo. You think, good, finally, we don't want to demonize fat. We want to help consumers understand that fat's part of a healthy diet. Here's the ones you would hopefully prioritize. I think where it starts to break down a little bit is back to how the inverted pyramid kind of visually directs you. It feels like we would be advised to eat a fair bit of red meat, butter, full fat dairy. These foods absolutely can be part of a healthy diet, but bear in mind, we still are going to keep our saturated fat to no more than 10% of total calories. That can often lead to a bit of a collision if someone were to start to really, calculate out, okay, I'm going to have this many glasses of whole milk, and then I want to have so many ounces of steak for dinner. And you start to do the math, and you're going to quickly jump up over those 10% of total daily calories on saturated fat. The other piece of the puzzle that I think I'm going to just chalk up to things we're moving quickly, trying to get these documents out. But that sentence around when cooking with or adding fats to meals, prioritize essential fatty acids, yes, such as olive oil. Okay, olive oil, no, it has less than 1% of essential fatty acid. Olive oil is the omega-9, and that's, the body technically can make that. It's not essential to eat it in the diet. That gets into the nutrition weeds very quickly. I don't think we necessarily need to have consumers be able to wax on about omega-3, omega-6, omega-9, but I do worry that we're sending both a mixed message and a message that may be hard to cross that bar, where we're like really saying, hey, don't eat too many saturated fats, no more than 10% of your calories, but hey, eat these kinds of foods that, by the way, come with a fair bit of animal saturated fat. And meanwhile, through all that, could we do something to help people eat, in that first bullet, more of their omega-3s? If we could get the omega-3 content up, I think that could be very impactful to the health of Americans. And I don't know that I feel like the debate is way on the animal, plant fat, saturated fat, like circling. And meanwhile, like omega-3 rich seafood, it's right there. I just don't know if it's gotten much airplay yet.
Kevin, any thoughts on fats?
I would really echo what Rachel said. I think, if you look at decades of recommendations to eat fatty fish, and the omega-3 status of North Americans is extremely low and has remained low. And if there was one like take home message, I would have loved it if it was like really hit home those 2 servings of fatty fish per week. And, unfortunately, there's a lot of noise and conflicting information across, with what's within the text, again, with what's within serving sizes, and then what's depicted within the upside down pyramid, and then also all the messaging you're seeing from the administration. That really, I think what comes through is, despite that 10% cap, it seems to be a huge focus on eating terrestrial animal fats and whole fat milk, which there's a lot of noise around the saturated fat thing. And the reality of the evidence base, when you look across it, it's that like nuts, seeds, extra virgin olive oil, omega-3 fatty acids, maybe some avocados have overwhelmingly the most evidence as being the healthful sources of fat. And that, to me, isn't the message that's really coming through here so much. So I think I would guess that the scientific review was written with the intention of not having that cap on saturated fat. I think a lot of folks were surprised that it survived. It was always a value from previous guidelines, just derived from the fact that you struggled to meet recommended intakes of other nutrients when you get above the 10% of calories from saturated fat, because they're non-essential nutrients. And when you skim whole milk down to regular milk, you don't really lose any essential nutrients, but you save a bunch of calories that you can spend, if you will, in other places, in other nutrient dense food sources. So I don't think that ever really came through in past guidelines that well, but it's not coming through now. So I think there's a number of things about this that just are quite conflicting, and the key messages that Americans need to hear and kind of focus on and what industry needs to focus on, I think, are getting lost in the noise. And again, we get a lot of our fat from meals eaten out, prepackaged meals, grain-based desserts, things where we don't really have control over the fat that Americans are not cooking all that much anymore. So I'll be very interested to see how the processed food industry responds to this, particularly on the saturated fat messaging, because palm oil right now is cheaper than soybean oil. And so those sorts of reformulation conversations, I'm sure, are happening behind the scenes. And again, I know this guideline does not recommend, high intakes of processed foods, but dietary guidelines have always been sliced and diced by industry to take, the low fat guidance turned into high refined grains, high added sugar guidance, even though it said don't eat a lot of sugars either. Mm-hmm. And so I do worry that the messaging that's coming out of this administration is sort of a bit more of a free for all on saturated fats. And you'll see industry making changes that are not so great. We've already seen this in the yogurt aisle with a lot of I think even before this guideline, there was a bit of a dairy fats are healthy, and you see,
whole milk yogurts kind of have come in waves, haven't they, as a trend?
Yeah, if you go into any grocery store, that whole milk yogurt aisle is full of sugary whole milk. Essentially desserts passing off as yogurt. And so I think industry has already been responding to some of the messaging around like dairy saturated fat is healthy again, of just serving up creamy, sugary options for folks, and within a lot of like natural marketing and things. So
yeah, and certainly what I'm seeing just in terms of kind of messaging to the consumer on product labeling is, again, I've seen a lot of no seed oil call outs on snacks, even though, again, that isn't specifically kind of stressed in the guidelines itself, although it does suggest butter and beef tallow as options, which I may surprise some dietitians. Ty, can
Yeah,
you?
I was going to say, well, on that point really quick, like they hate seed oil so much, but seed oil is a huge portion of the marketplace, and a growing one has been modified to be high oleic. So you can have high oleic corn oil, high oleic canola oil, high oleic soy, like that look very similar in composition to olive oil and are cheap, and there's nothing wrong with them. And so why olive oil got called out so heavily, and then how butter, I think we all know how butter and beef tallow slipped in there with some of the fanfare about beef tallow, French fries and things. But there's many ways to cook with low essential fatty acid oils, which is essentially what the scientific review was supporting from Amir Taha's section. So lots of confusing things in here. I think, great for the olive oil industry. It's a shame we don't have domestic olive oil farmers that are all too big of a marketplace, but I'm not sure. Yeah, sorry, go for it.
Sorry, Ty, any thoughts on fats?
Yeah, I agree with what Rachel and Kevin shared. I think that if I was drafting this, I would have liked to see the omega-3 rich seafood first, and then the nuts and seeds, avocados, olives, because those are, I think, as everyone said, they're more demonstratively healthful, right? I think it's nice to see the emphasis on whole foods, at least. I think that could have come through stronger too. When I look at the other options can include, one of the things most people probably haven't seen is that in the serving sizes, while they do list 4.5 teaspoons of added fat, so either like a butter is given as an example, they do say small amounts of added fats like butter could be added if needed. I would like to see that more front and center, because I think there's a lot of evidence to suggest the whole food sources, like the whole food dairy, for example, is better than the butter for a lot of reasons. The food matrix, the milk fat globule membrane. And so that could have come through stronger. Obviously conflicting statement there about olive oil being high in essential fatty acids, which it's not. It just says it contains it, right? I think that olive oil was probably called out because it's one of the least controversial oils, and they were probably trying to thread some sort of needle compromising. But I agree with what people have shared. If you also look at the evidence review on saturated fat, there was not strong evidence for that 10% cap, right? So there's sort of a judgment call to keep that in there. And I think there's certainly ways to eat follow these guidelines without exceeding that. But I think if you go by sort of the messaging and you don't restrict any sort of fatty foods, and you have the full serving size is recommended or as options of butter and beef tallow, I think you're going to exceed that. I don't think the added butter or beef tallow is doing anyone any benefits. And I certainly don't think switching from the seed oils to palm oil is going to improve any health of the population when you look at the ultra processed foods. So I think that is probably will be used by industry, just like the protein will be used by industry, and I'm worried about that aspect. But at least there's a big, strong emphasis on the whole foods.
I want to talk just a bit about affordability, because obviously, let me just pull back the. Okay, so again, I keep focusing on these big graphics, but steak is pretty expensive. The Scientific Foundation report criticizes the original Dietary Guidelines Advisory Report, and it claims that it was looking at these guidelines through a health equity lens, and says that we should just focus on the science. I mean, I find that a little strange, because, I guess there's a reason why we haven't historically recommended, lobster and caviar and saffron, that affordability presumably should factor into these guidelines, in my view. But I'm just wondering if you can speak a bit to the affordability piece. Shouldn't we be looking through a health equity lens when we're coming up with dietary guidelines for Americans? Does anyone want to jump in?
I could start. I think that you absolutely want to see that. I think the intent of the report, the way that I read it, is sort of, we should separate the effort to get the science on, and you can debate whether you think that was right or not, like whether the science is right or not. But the idea is, what does the science say about what we should eat, and then how do we sort of get as close to that as possible through the social kind of economic world, right? And I think a lot of these levers, like the procurement levers of school meals, of hospitals and military food, can start reducing prices of some of these whole foods if there's an economy of scale where it becomes more cost effective per quantity to produce by industry. I eat a ribeye like once a year. So I don't eat it because of the cost primarily, right? And so, and I'm like a middle class citizen. So I think that, there could have been a better, I think, more attention paid to sort of reflecting a bit more of the affordable foods here. I do see the green beans, and you see some regular legumes and stuff, but it's not necessarily the same emphasis. So I think I would like to see a lot of attention paid to that. I think there is an effort, even with SNAP, like changing the incentives through SNAP can have an impact on what is more affordable. Like taking sugar sweetened beverages off of SNAP will make a difference, I think, over the long term. So I hope that happens. I think a lot of what we're all sort of waiting to see is these guidelines are out. Now what's next, and what policies are we going to see? I get very concerned about how do you actually take where we are right now and equitably and fairly try to get all people to get caught up to healthier diets. And I think about school meals in particular, because I have kids in school and public schools, and many schools don't have kitchens.
I was going to say, the emphasis, as you say, is pulling away from highly processed foods, having more whole foods, but that requires people, kitchens to prepare them. It requires more staff to prepare them. It requires maybe more time to serve them. And that all of that requires money. And I don't see any associated additional funding allocated to school meals going along with these guidelines.
Yeah, and I think at the states, what you've seen, which I think is remarkable, is that dozens of states have put in legislation before these guidelines came out to restrict soda and SNAP or to change school meals pretty significantly. Like in my state of Arizona, essentially limiting ultra-processed foods or restricting them. And I've sat on some of these discussions with the legislators, and I've heard some states where they are really thoughtful and mindful about how is this going to happen? How can we actually support? There's grant programs and things at the state level. And then I've seen other states where there's not really a lot of investment, and it's just sort of whoever can adhere to it will do so. I think that there's a lot of potential gain in getting the American population healthy to the individual themselves with their own health expenses and to Medicare and other things. However, there needs to be actual mechanisms for, if there is cost savings, and even at the start, how do we help, like, for example, schools? How do we help those schools that don't have the infrastructure, the staff, the training? They may want to adhere to this and produce. Of course, I think most parents and most faculty at schools would say we want the children to be eating freshly prepared foods, like Italy and France and Switzerland. My friends and colleagues, they share what their kids are eating, and I'm super jealous, right? But to get there has to be a policy change and an investment in that sort of approach and infrastructure. So I want to see that, and I would hope that can happen, but I think it's going to take a lot of work and probably a lot of both top-down and grassroots movements to make that happen.
I want to talk just finally about a couple of things, including the use of the term processed foods. I think it's somewhat misleading, some of the messaging around these guidelines when they're talking about as if they were suggesting that the previous guidelines actively promoted processed foods, which I don't think they did. But maybe, the language in these ones is more explicitly talking about the term processed foods. But could anybody just kind of jump in on what that actually means? And again, because we don't have a federal definition of ultra processed or highly processed at the moment, what people should take away from this, and if it's good, even if we don't have a definition yet, that there's that sort of explicit guidance for consumers. Kevin?
Yeah, I can speak to it. I just really quick on the last question about DEI. I think we got off and didn't. I just want to say really quick. I think it's very fair for dietary guidelines to consider how race, socioeconomic status, culture, ethnicity. I mean, those are so intimately interwoven, not only with what we eat, why we eat, how food is advertised to us, what foods are available within your local environment. There's things like lactose intolerance is much more common in certain ethnic groups. So taking a health equity framework and looking as you go through and do food pattern modeling, making sure you're not recommending a dietary pattern to meet nutrient requirements that is like something only a sliver of the population eats. I think is an important lens to look at your data through. I know that the committee looked a lot in their systematic reviews of diet and chronic disease risk. They tried to find evidence, but in the process, they called out a lot that like, hey, most of the data is from high socioeconomic status individuals, predominantly white, female, or college-age students and things. So we don't have a representative data that is available within the scientific literature. We often have food composition databases that are also quite narrow and don't have culturally, ethnically diverse foods. So you don't want to recommend a dietary pattern at the end of the day that people can't afford, doesn't align with people's values.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
I mean, I think this is... You look at, if you go to diverse populations and cultures and ask them how do they interpret this pyramid, how they interpret the dietary guidelines, how they interpret words like processed foods, you're going to get really different results. And so not taking a health act, I'm not surprised this administration and the kind of war on DEI and how politically useful that has been for them, threw away health equity. And I'm all for the science, but the science isn't the only thing that dictates why.
Yeah, and it's not in a vacuum either, right? Yeah.
Right, and nutrition's not a prescription. It's not like there's one food that you're recommending. Many you don't see Chinese vegetables on here. I don't think local Asian populations in San Francisco, where I just came from, are going to look at this and really understand exactly what it means or how to prioritize different food sources. So,
and there is a science, there's social science that actually looks at this as well. So of course there are scientific ways to look at food cultures and preferences and affordability and all of that. I don't think I fully agree with Kevin's point, and I think that like I would like to see that. I think that was not necessarily the intention of the report. It was to say, first let's look at the evidence and then let's figure out how to meet there. But I understand that part of the evidence is looking at the inequity and the sort of distribution of who has access to which types of foods, and how do you model diets, or how do you prescribe diets that are culturally relevant, and that the U.S. is super diverse. Right.
Yeah.
And so that's not reflected necessarily in the pyramid itself.
Rachel, can you just talk a bit about the explicit wording around processed foods?
Sure. What struck me is in the 10-page version, the word was limit highly processed foods, and then the first bullet says avoid highly processed, packaged, prepared, and ready to eat foods. So limit, avoid, is it ultra processed? They didn't use that term in the 10-page. Backing out of all that and knowing we're still all debating what is the definition, I think the conversation for me around processed foods goes back to your previous question on affordability. Money is usually what we're thinking about on affordability, but time. There are time constraints. I happen to have a personal tie to this, growing up with a single parent, and we were on what we then called food stamps, which would now be SNAP. And part of it is, can you afford the food you want? And I like that the pyramid has, as others have pointed out, it has a can of green beans, very affordable. It has frozen peas, like all forms count in the fruits and vegetables. That's a really good message. But in terms of either having to avoid or limit highly processed foods, I feel like that is, it's a populist opinion at this point to say, hey, if we just get rid of all that and they're not 60% of our calories, we'll all be so much healthier. I think that line in the sand is too firm at the moment from the vantage point that where is the nuance? Is there a time and place when a highly processed, I don't know, tortilla or something, or cereal that's not super high in added sugars, couldn't there be a time and place for some of those foods when paired with whole milk or when paired with chicken? Or, I wish that it could feel like it's more doable and actionable and not words like avoid. Because I think it sends a message that unless and until you eat only whole foods, hopefully you can afford them with the money you have available. Hopefully you have the time. Time. It takes a lot of time to prepare whole foods. I mean, I think the higher order message is right. We want to move in this direction, but we can't act as though our consumers are just going to be able to shift gears and afford all these foods, have the time to prepare them, chop them, clean them, cook them, go to the grocery store. Like, it's a whole different way that I think we can move towards, but I wish that there was a better sense of like this continuum and like the the direction we're trying to go. And I suppose you could argue it's there but not there, and it maybe depends on who's interpreting this. But if I just look at the image we're looking at now, there's no room for the time constraint that would have someone think, are some highly processed foods okay? And if so, which ones? Can someone help me navigate that?
Yes, yeah. Anyone else want to come in on the processed foods?
I think this was the probably the most, I think, thing that I'm proud of, that I'm excited about, is the intentional call out. Now, previous guidelines did not say eat a bunch of highly processed foods,
Sure.
right? They emphasize, if you look at it, they emphasize nutrient density a lot. However, they did not specifically call out highly processed foods, and they had a high allowance of refined carbohydrates, right? Up to half of grains could be from refined grains. So I think that this is a big win. The stronger limits on added sugars, I think, is a positive. I totally see Rachel's point, and I think that there is this aspect of, I never think about in my own personal life or with my kids, like, avoid completely, right? My kids eat candy, my kids eat treats. It's just about limiting and having them in moderation, right? It's like the 80-20 rule, right? Having the foundation be the nourishing foods. So I would like to see a little bit more nuance around that too. I think that I'm still overall pretty pleased, at least, with the high level message here.
Mm-hmm. So I kind of just want to end now, just in the last couple of minutes, just with any kind of top line observations that you guys have. Maybe starting with you, Kevin. Overall, do these guidelines kind of bring us forward or take us backwards? You know, what's your sort of top line view of these now that the dust has settled a little bit?
Yeah, I don't think the dust has settled enough. This is a huge transformation of a document that was previously used by healthcare practitioners and policymakers to effectuate federal programs, both on the ground and sort of what's top down at the policy level. And this transformation to a 10-page document, how it's going to hold up the pillars of that foundation and how it's going to be used I think is going to be very interesting. I think Ty alluded to this. We're at a odd time where everything is shifting from smaller federal government, less ability to do much of anything, and this action happening at the states. So I think, if anything, the fact that this is a forward-facing kind of influencer vibes document, maybe it's not intended to be a federal policy document nearly as much anymore, because things are drifting towards state-level regulations, which, for any of your industry folks listening, it's going to be a fun time for them as they deal with
over the next year or two.
Yeah. So I mean, we're just, what is going to happen in the future, I think, is extremely hard to tell, and whether there's going to be tweaks or changes, or when they actually get to the point of going to the Code of Federal Regulations and trying to turn this into policy, whether there'll be different executive decisions made, whether that will be challenged by industry groups. I mean, we are kind of in a wild west here, as we've, the goal of the dietary guidelines starting in 2005 was really to be this healthcare practitioner user and policy document. And I think this is a decent reversion back, not an entire reversion back, on the same processed foods note. There is, without a federal definition of what a processed food is, I think it's, again, pretty hard to actually decide if you're what is going to be put into CFR and how you effectuate that as like a school food manager or whatever. So it'll be interesting. I think everybody just needs to sit and watch and wait and see how these actually get utilized at the end of the day. And, we're still in the midst of fanfare, and HHS's Instagram is blowing up, showing whole foods or whole milk mustaches and all these sorts of things now. So when all that dust settles, will it survive the news cycle to really change the culture? Will it, drive momentum at the state and local level? Like it seems like the goal. I think it's anybody's guess.
How about you, Rachel? What do you think? I mean, we were talking just before we hit record about how the packaged food industry, or some of the people that you work with, are kind of thinking about this.
I think it's an interesting, opportune time to really ask some of these tougher questions. A lot of the industry individuals I've interacted with have, frankly, a lot of questions, like, what does this mean for front of pack labeling, or what does this mean for, my high protein, or do I not? What's high protein anymore? And like the questions are plentiful, both from a regulatory point of view, a marketing point of view. What will the consumer be thinking? Like there are a lot of questions, which I think is a good thing. I don't think that's a sign of anything bad to come. I think it's more kind of, as Kevin is saying, like once the dust settles, I've been part of this, through working in the industry as I have and working as a consultant for many years. I've been through many dietary guidelines before. I've never seen this amount of fervor around them. Sometimes very confrontational, very emotional, battle lines drawn kind of attitudes. I think that's unfortunate. I hope that passes. I hope that this document serves as a instigator of productive conversation and intelligent decisions. I'm not sure, time will tell, but I do really hope that, as we say, the dust settling, I hope that some authentic, real conversations happen among both scientists who may disagree, consumers who may disagree, policymakers. Like there's just like, we've just thrown it all up in the air, and now we've got to see how and where it's going to land.
And Ty, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I'm overall really pleased with the high level message. And I think that what I really don't like seeing is the polarization and the non-constructive communication of just trying to make a point or nitpick or promote this or criticize the past guidelines, right, excessively. Like I think that what we should be working towards is this, what do we agree about? Like the high level message of eat nutrient dense whole foods and minimize or limit highly processed foods and refined carbohydrates. I think that message alone is something that most people can agree on. And with that, like there are lots of ways to achieve that healthy diet, right? There are lots of diverse ways to do that. It could be more plant-based, it could be more animal-based. I think what we'll have to wait and see, and I hope that we don't just sit back and relax, but like can be involved in any way we can, is to how do we get this message, which we largely agree about, but these minimally processed, nutrient-dense whole foods, and how do we actually get the policies to make this change a reality? I'm optimistic because even before the guidelines came out this past year, we've seen something never before. We see the Senate talking about ultra-processed foods. That hasn't happened before. I gave a lecture to a state legislator about ultra-processed foods, getting questions about all sorts of stuff that I don't think politicians have been paying attention to. The fact that dozens of states have already enacted guidelines around sugar-sweetened beverages and school meals, it shows that there's really a big, I think this is a tipping point. I think we're going to see actual change. Now, I don't think you can only do so much with guidelines. And I think there's going to be there's a lot of investment that needs to be made. And I don't know if we'll see the investment that needs to be made, but I really hope so. And I hope that we can get behind the overall message that we're really sick as a population. I think 3/4 of us are overweight or obese. Most of us have some form of chronic disease, or at least are not optimal, right? And so I think that we really want to see big changes. And so hopefully we can get behind that, and then we'll save money in the long run, and we'll have healthier, happier lives if we do change the way that we eat.
Okay, well, on that note, thank you so much to all of my experts. Really appreciate your time, and have a wonderful rest of your day.